Hi, welcome everyone to Think Copilot. My name is Garry Trinder. I'm a cloud developer advocate at M365 at Microsoft. I have with me today Waldek.
Hey everybody, my name is Waldek Mastykarz, and I am developer advocate for Microsoft 365 at Microsoft.
Perfect. And we have another guest with us today. We have Lee with us. Lee, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello. Yes, so my name is Lee Ford. I'm a development lead at a company called Symity. I'm based in the UK. We're a Microsoft partner, and we do pretty much most of M365. And when it comes to anything extensible within M365, that kind of generally falls on my plate to look at. So yeah, things like Teams apps. That's traditionally what I've been working on.
Perfect. So very much in development land. You're a developer yourself,
Yes.
Development lead.
Yes.
So it kind of will ask the question, right? Copilot. How is Copilot helping you day to day? You know, what kind of things are you using Copilot for?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, I am using it every day, pretty much every working day anyway. I would say there's probably 3 Copilots that I use. Obviously, there's not just one Copilot to rule them all. So if I go through maybe the least used to the most used, the least used, I'm probably using something like copilot.microsoft.com or the Bing sort of version of that, where you're asking a general question. Might not necessarily be specific direct developer facing. It might just be, I'm trying to do this thing or trying to do this, or what about this? And rather than me spending 30 minutes, half an hour, reading a load of articles to try and summarize the information, so that's where something like Microsoft Copilot can come in. That's kind of, I use that infrequently, but I do use it when needed. The one that I've probably used a bit more than that is M365 Copilot, or Copilot for Microsoft 365, however you want to word it. That one I do use, I'd say, probably a few times a day, and that's where I'm trying to get some information about the company, or we've got some plugins that we use internally to reference things like sales data and things like that. That's something that I do use quite often, just to, like I say, ask questions, summarize some data. And the big one for me on the M365 Copilot is the recaps of meetings, recaps of conversations. So that'll be, I've missed a meeting, or I've come too late to a meeting, or being a developer, I'm trying to write code and attend a meeting at the same time, and you're not fully paying attention, and then you're like at the end, okay, what was I meant to be doing again? And you get that recap, go, Lee was going to do this, Lee was going to do that. That's very useful for me. And I think the other thing, I don't really spend that much time in things like Word and Excel and PowerPoint, but I have started using the tooling in there. So summarize this, or can you reword this better because I'm not great with words, and give us a bit more flesh on the bones to what I've written. Those I use quite regularly, and then the one that I absolutely use all the time is Copilot in GitHub. So I use it within VS Code. That's the one that I really do kind of use on a regular basis. And there's kind of 2 ways I use that one. One is the kind of autocomplete. So you're writing through and some code, and it goes, oh, I see what you're trying to do here. Let me finish it off for you. And then the other one is there's a chat context that you can have on the side, and that's a bit more like a chat GPT. Ask it a question. It's more developer facing than, say, something you'd write into GPT, and we'll come back with a load of information for you. Those are the 3 that I use. GitHub one being by far the most useful for me on a daily basis, anyway.
You mentioned some interesting thing. You mentioned a lot, but there's one thing that triggered my attention, right? Like, you mentioned a few things about how you use it with regards to summarizing meetings, catching up with things. If you zoom out a little, how do you see Copilot changing your behavior and thinking?
Yeah, so when it comes to things like meetings, I'm terrible at taking notes, for one. So I will write them on a piece of paper, but then I'll lose that piece of paper, or I'll write it in a book and then I forget to use that book for my notes, or I'll start writing it in a notes app or something, and I'm great at starting it, but then I kind of don't keep that pattern. I sort of have bad habits, really. So for me, something, yeah, almost relying on something like the recap, or you know, if I've not, you know, the meeting was 2 weeks ago and I've been on holiday or something like that, I'm just like, let me just, I don't really want to watch an hour's meeting again, but I do need to know where we're up to. Or like you say, I've missed 5 meetings because I've been off for a week, and those meetings, I do need to know the gist of it, but I don't have 5 hours to spend in those meetings. I just need to know, you know, ask Copilot, you know, what should I really be concerned about based off that meeting. Those things that I think will change dramatically the amount of time that I have to spend doing those tasks, which gives frees me more time to build apps and do other things that I'd rather be doing than
the most important things, right?
Exactly right. Yeah, as a developer, that's writing code. Is, you know, that's what you live for. So
yeah. I mentioned or I noticed in myself, like, so I've got 2 kids, right? They are about to be 8 and 11, and if there's one thing that is really about kids is they come with these randomest questions, asking about anything and everything, just like stuff I have no idea about, like why are things the way they are, or how many does take to do X. Like in the past, I would say I don't know, because there wasn't even a really easy way to look it up. Nowadays, it's just like I pull up my phone, entering the prompt. I ended with Eli 7, Eli 10, basically just to get the age right.
Mm-hmm.
And like every single time we get the answer, it's like,
nails
and it's,
it.
if anything else, it's funny because it's, you know, the curiosity in them is like this part, like they get an answer, and it's a genuine, or at least we hope, a real answer, or it feels real, but it's really like it often leads to, you know, like sparking discussions, talking through things, thinking through, as opposed to in the past that would be like, I don't know, stop, right?
Yeah,
so,
no, I've got an 8 and 11-year-old as well, so I
yeah, there you go.
yeah.
Yeah, and then another thing that I see with myself is when I code, right? Like in the past, I would just, you know, get my teeth in it and try to like break it down. I need a regex, or I need something. I would just figure it out. No, I'm just like, I'm lazy. I just like, give me the code and it will be 80, 90% good, but I can just adapt it to my needs. I understand it, read it. I see that it does what it's supposed to do, but then I don't start from an empty sheet. And that saves me so much time, right? Like that is a huge improvement.
That's something that I've noticed. So that the things that when it comes to a developer perspective, using Copilots, is you don't realize how long it takes to get from a blank piece of paper to get something up and running. And usually, you know, it's not just a case of, you know, npm install something and everything's working. You know, you've got to wait, you've got to scaffold the project, you've got to set it all up, and sometimes you just say, look, just give me something to like get it up and running, and then I can fill in the blanks. That's something that I have been using more and more. And like you say, it's not necessarily perfect all the time, but it gets you 80-90% of the way there, and then you can then go, not sure about that, or I don't like the way it's done that, I'd rather do it with a promise or something. You know, there's always something like, you know, there's different ways of doing the same thing, and sometimes it's personal preference, and not necessarily that it's done it the wrong way. So I think that's some examples. I think the 2 that stand out to me, they're my kryptonite really, are regex. You know, how when I get a regex, you know, how I want it to be, and obviously Copilot, it's way smarter than me. It just goes, oh yeah, this is what you're trying to do. Here's the regex, and
then we just blurb this long string, and you're like,
yeah, exactly. And I'm like,
okay,
never would have got
whatever.
That would have taken me a week. And the other one is testing scripts. No one likes doing them. Obviously, they should be done. Not everyone does them. But I find that's something that really is like, you know, that really helps me. And something we haven't touched on in there is I can look at like a massive test script that something's done for you know, a project that maybe I don't maintain or something, or an example, and I'll be like, I don't actually know what it's trying to do here. And that's another thing that I find really good in GitHub Copilot is explain this to me. And you know, going back to, you know, your kids explain like at 5, I need
Eli
that almost
5,
code
yeah,
sometimes.
this code, Eli 5, and it's assembly code, and you're like, how do I explain this like you're 5?
yeah, but it works. I don't know how it does it. It's amazing. And that's the thing that I do find is really useful, is when I don't quite understand the subject enough, but I've read a few blogs and I'm just like, it's just not sinking in, and then it kind of just boils it down almost to a certain point where I go, oh, okay, I get what this is now. I get why it's doing it like this. And then once I've done that, I kind of leave Copilot and go off and do what I need to do. And that's
Right.
yeah, I find that's super useful as well in GitHub.
Yeah, I think that you kind of have highlighted a couple of things that we don't necessarily talk about, because we talk about maybe Copilot as just generating code, right? But it's also there for being summarization, being a critic as well, of like, oh, is there anything that I should be, thinking about in this code? Provide me some recommendations. And they might be things that, best practice and things that you're not necessarily always got at the top of mind, like as you're writing code, but it's like always nice to kind of sit back and go, okay, what I've got, to your point, like style, personal preference, but then also, are there any issues with this that I may not see and they may not be obvious? I think that's something
super good. That is super good. Yes, you're right, because there is something in there where, for example, maybe there's a gap in your error checking or something like that, where something can fall through the gaps, and you wouldn't spot it unless you happen to do that particular scenario. Whereas it can almost compute what you've done and go, oh well, what about this? What about that? Like say, it's almost like when you submit something for review, pull request or whatever, and someone else will pour through it line by line and go, oh, what about this, Lee? You haven't thought about this. And that's where, obviously, like you say, something like GitHub can come in and go, Lee, what have you done? So at least you can do that in public.
Oh God, dude. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like it almost feels like you would have your own red team. Like basically people who like you can just ask at a whim. It's like, hey, break this code, and there's like, yeah, I will write this code. Like if you do this and that, it's gonna break. And it's like, that's interesting. And then you can judge whether that's something real and something that you should take into account, or it's like no, like people would never do that.
Super edge case.
In other words, I mean, you would never order -1 beers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's sometimes a lot theoretically yes, but in practice no. Yes, absolutely.
So we've talked quite a lot. Have you got any examples? Like you mentioned about your blank page problem, right? So have you got an example of kind of like when you've kind of got ahead of that? Maybe, how did you start? What input did you have to give to get, what you needed and faster?
I can explain that. So one, for example, I typically use something like Cosmos database for writing or what my sort of database storage needs really. So writing JSON, getting JSON, and recently I sort of started looking at Mongoose and MongoDB, Mongoose being the client, and thinking, okay, well maybe I should look into how this works, because it's very similar to Cosmos. But turns out it sounds like it's very similar, but actually when you start using the client, it's not that simple. So I had a sort of exercise where, okay, right, I'm going to start with a brand new project. I don't really want to kind of use an existing project. So it was like, okay, can you scaffold the project? I want to run it in Azure Functions, V4 model. I don't want to, so I can then host it in the cloud. And it took all this, and effectively added the bits into the code. So one thing I did do beforehand is that I created a function project, created a function, and then, but after that, I basically left it up to Copilot. So I went into Copilot in VS Code, selected the file that I was working on and said, look, this is what I want to do inside of here. And it's like, okay, you need to install these packages. You need to, connect to it this way. You need to store the environmental variables in a JSON file because it's an Azure function. All this sort of stuff that, yes, I knew how to do it, but it saved me a load of time because it was almost like a copy and paste. And it's very hard not to try and be too lazy and rely on it too much, because it generally gets it right a lot of the time. So, and it's one of those things like, as you get older and maybe you kind of become more manager and less sort of working on the tools as such, you kind of lose touch with what you're doing. And that's what I'm trying not to do, is use it too much to the point where all I'm doing is basically asking it to do everything for me. At that point, what am I actually doing myself? What do I, and I guess everyone is going to have that battle. It's just knowing when, this is a repetitive task. I already know how to do this. I haven't got time to do it. So can you do it for me? Sometimes it'll be, I don't understand this. Can you help me? And then it's the other times where like I know how to do this, and I'm just being lazy, and I could do it myself, but and that's the ones where you kind of got to try and do it where it makes sense to do it and saves you time, because literally copying and pasting and modifying something 100 times doesn't make much sense when Copilot can just do it for you. Whereas if it's like, oh, can you work out a really complicated thing for me that I could work it out for myself, but I want you to do it for me because I'd rather, I don't know, watch YouTube or something. That's ultimately the balance you got to have.
I wonder to what point that's related to the fact that, like, if I look back at the career that I had in the past, like I would work on kind of very much the same technology stack for a year, 2, 3 years. So like very much like working in kind of the same space, building more of the same things. And sure, like the projects I work on were not exactly the same, but it was very much the same stack. Whereas now, one day I'm working on functions. The other day, I'm building a script in Bash. Then I'm doing something in PowerShell. Then it's C#. Then it's TypeScript. So I am all over that place. And with that, it's so much easier for me. Like I know what I want to do, and I know like the basic, or even the basic. Like I know how how you code. I know all the things about like loops, conditions, variables, functions, and all of that. I might not know the syntax or the package that I would use for something. So to have an assistant that helps me with those, platform technology specific things that I don't do every day, to me, that is invaluable. It saves me so much time.
That's very true. So before I kind of really went hard into development, I generally used to automate things in PowerShell, and I still do to a certain extent. But that's going back to where I haven't touched something for it, or not using it every day. You kind of memory gets a little bit hazy, and that's where, like say, Copilot can go, oh yeah. No, you don't do it like that. This is how you do it in PowerShell, because I'm trying to, I don't know, do it in JavaScript or something. But this is how you do it in PowerShell, and that's for me is where, like you say, you're not expecting it to teach you a language from scratch. It's more just, can you just refresh my memory almost to a certain extent, and then you go, oh yeah, I remember now, this is how I used to do it in PowerShell. So the next time you don't need to ask Copilot because you've remembered it from 2 days ago. I think you're right. When you're kind of, like say, working in one, say, language and one technology stack, it's very straightforward and you kind of get used to it and you're into a nice groove. But then, like say, someone goes, oh, I need a bash script for this, or can you create me a GitHub Actions pipeline to do all these random things that, well, I don't build pipelines every day. I'm not a DevOps person really. So that's where it's really, really useful for me anyway.
Helps you on those days where your mind is just like not on the job either. It's just like you have those days, you have those down days. They always happen. Those Mondays.
Mondays or Friday afternoon.
And Fridays and Wednesdays, Fridays, Thursdays, Tuesdays.
And it just helps and speeds up that whole process. I mean, so you talked quite a bit about the general just kind of Copilots, quite like, you mentioned using Copilots to just help with your day-to-day, like meetings. That's really interesting. The whole point about, well, I'd rather be developing and writing code in meetings, so I can use the recap to be like, oh, for a couple of minutes, it's fine. I can catch up. But obviously to track your tasks as well, almost as well, by using those meeting notes, and then obviously actually helping you write the code with GitHub Copilot. If that was to go tomorrow, how would you feel?
I can kind of almost answer this in a way. So I've had it with GitHub Copilot where, either something maybe it's my end or something, but it's just not working. So I'm writing the thing, waiting for it to like show the completion in the code. It's like, where is it? Why is it not working? And it feels like I'm typing one-handed all of a sudden. Because all of a sudden you're like, oh, hang on, I've got to figure everything out for myself now. It's like my kids when you ask them to do something, oh, but I don't know how to do that. All of a sudden, like trying to teach them to like be independent. It feels like that all of a sudden to me with coding. All of a sudden, like I've lost all these tools and this person to lean on almost. Where if you've ever got an issue, you can just ask Copilot, what about this? And they're always going to, where it's different, if you're asking, say, a colleague or something, they might be in a meeting, they might be off. So all of a sudden, you kind of have that kind of extra tool in your armory, and all of a sudden you don't, and you just, you kind of, I think that one is definitely the one that I would struggle with. And then I think also the M365 Copilot, you kind of get used to having it, really. It's like a lot of things, isn't it? Once you used to having that tool, if someone's to take it away, it does very much feel like, like say, you're kind of less productive, or you've got less time to spend to do other things because now you have to do these manual processes again, which you got used to not doing. So definitely would notice it.
Cool. So with that as well, like it very much sounds like it's embedded in the way that you work. You have to kind of build that muscle, right? Of like, oh, hang on, no, I can use Copilot. And at first, it's an effort, right, to think that way, to change the way you change your behavior, right? It's how you've done things in the past. So, is there anything like prompts or things that you just keep going back to, things that really useful, part of your own little toolkit for getting the best out of the different Copilots that you use?
Yeah, I mean, for GitHub, I use where you highlight the bit of code that you're working on, and then you can do like in the chat you can go like /fix or /explain, and then it will kind of explain that bit of code for you. One thing that I learned recently is if you anywhere within VS Code, anywhere in the code, you can just do like Command I, which might be Control I on a Windows machine, and it will then bring up a prompt. You can say like, can you explain this for me, or can you extend this to include these properties or something? And it just does it in the code. You don't have to like ask it, in a simple conversation and then bring out the output and paste it into your code. It's kind of a bit more intuitive, really. So that's something that I've learned to use. And then on the M365 Copilot, it's I think what I'm trying to get better at, I think it's hard, really, like because I've built plugins and graph connectors and things like that, and it's kind of just knowing how to ask the question, really, not trying to be too generic to the point where it doesn't quite understand what you're asking for. So I think for me, it's just learning to be more specific, and that's
right.
As a developer, that's always something I kind of battle against, because I want to make something as easy to use for everyone as possible. So when you see these slides of people saying, "Oh, this is how you should ask AI these things," it's like, well, no, like we shouldn't have to train people to ask things in a more robotic way. In theory, I don't know, maybe it should be able to understand what we're saying a bit better. But I guess it's a constant improvement there. So.
Well, and I think it's also that is an interesting point, right? Because like the interesting part is, like, for all these years, we kind of spent so much time and effort evolving UIs, right? To the point where we can choose things almost with our mind. You look at something and with your eyes, you can click on a screen. You select an icon, and that activity conveys an intent, and it's very rich. And then we kind of go back all the way to text, and now we're typing a novel every single time we want to do something which is comparably easy to do, like on the calendar, select a meeting. Well, in text, there is no agenda, right? So you got to explain which one of the 200 you've got on the calendar in a week you mean, right? So and you don't have access to an ID, right? So you need to explain all of that, and that isn't really efficient. I think we will see some, or at least I hope we will see some improvements there. But I also have a lot of hope for things like GPTs and assistants, right? Where you can kind of preempt them with, this is your scope. And then the prompt or the thing you actually want to ask becomes really short because of that embedded background, the system prompt that it's already got in it. And the data is grounded and like choose from this set and not from that set. Like all these instructions are already embedded, and we can just talk about the things that we actually mean, as opposed to every single time as if, you meet somebody for the first time. And before you ask them something, you got to explain who they are, what they do, what they think, what they had for lunch, and so forth and so on.
Yeah, no, exactly right. I think building things like plugins for Copilot is part of that. Is kind of trying to almost with things like manifest, you're trying to kind of like preempt the types of questions people are going to ask to try and catch all those, like say, generic things. But shuffle them down to your context, i.e. your app that you've got answers for. And like I say, I think it's I don't think it's an exact science. And obviously because it's artificial intelligence, there is some intelligence there. So it's not always reproducible as well. So, ask us same question 10 times and you don't always get the same answer 10 times. So as a developer, that's not good. Like you want to test something 100 times, it gives you the same thing 100 times, but doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Another thing, and I wanted to ask you, Lee, going back in time, do you recall still the first time you got to work with LLM or chat and it clicked, like you used it for something like, aha, the light bulb went off? You recall that?
Yeah, so I think for me, obviously things like GPT, obviously I think a lot of people, and things like DALL-E, those were kind of like whoa moments really. But for me, I'm a little bit of I wouldn't say I'm a cynic, but I kind of need to like use it a lot and don't kind of buy into the hype as such. So I think the kind of the first like, oh, this is actually really good and really, really useful was probably using the one in GitHub, VS Code, where, I was like, oh, can you go do this thing for me? And I was like, whoa, it actually knew what I was going to say. And I think the thing that blew my mind was you start doing something in one file and it like updates a bit and you're like, okay, yep, that looks cool, yep, okay. And then you go do something else, it's like, and it already knows what you want to do in that file. You're not even typed anything. And it's like, how does it know?
And you're like,
yeah. You what like as a program running on my machine, I share my screen. It was kind of just blew my mind that it could effectively almost think what you were thinking before you were thinking it. That's the one thing that really all of a sudden was like, whoa, this is not just a gimmick. This is actually real. This is gonna like help me in my job, and that absolutely makes a difference.
Yeah, I think the one thing we maybe not mentioned, and come back to the point you're making, is it's that context, that it's not just, like IntelliSense, which can be, pretty static. It's like, here's a best guess of like the next like thing that you're going to do, like the property or the method that you're going to use next. Whereas Copilot is actually looking at things a lot wider. And I think, one of the moments, and you mentioned it earlier about writing tests, was tests started to write themselves because of the code that I was writing, and Copilot could look at that and go, oh, well, here's an example test, right? And it gives you the basis, and you can go through and you can try that. But it's like, that's where the kind of the magic happens, because it has that level of understanding that we haven't had in the past. I think.
Absolutely. I think it's great at kind of like say working out what you want to do. And sometimes I've found it's, you'll do a bit of code and then you'll autocomplete a bit and then it will autocomplete something else. Like, oh, I hadn't even thought about doing that. That's a really cool way of doing it. That's a more elegant way than I was going to do it. And it, kind of blows your mind again. You're like, oh yeah, of course. Why didn't I think of that? So yeah, it absolutely is. For me, I don't want to sound. I'm not getting paid, by the way, but I just really do like the GitHub Copilot. It's that's definitely the one that I've found that kind of really makes a difference.
In the learning aspect, I just thought as you were saying that, it's like, I remember back to early days of my career when you're a junior dev, you're working with other seniors, and you're kind of a bit like, oh my God, the code that they're writing, they're producing, you're like, how do you get to that level, right? And then
GPT, 3 words. They had it already for all these years.
GPT may have been other tooling, right, in the past, but things progress. But it's like you have to see things and be kind of like exposed to those different ways of doing things to then have those like a moment of, oh, right, okay, yeah, what I've done is okay, but this is even better. This is like the next level to get to. Now, we're more working remotely, right? We're not in teams. We're not in groups of people in the same room. It's harder to have them moments of just like, hey, come and look at this code that I've done, right? It's a Teams call now. It's sharing your screen. It's a lot harder. Whereas Copilot feels like it's filling that gap a little bit. That kind of, learning aspect of seeing other ways of doing code.
I think so. Like I say, going back to the explain thing, I think that's definitely one that I find useful. And I think you can do this in, if you use like sort of Microsoft Copilot, or M365 Copilot, you can ask a similar sort of question. It's like, can you explain this to me? But I typically do it in VS Code. If someone's written some code, I'm like, like you say, a team member, they might be busy. You don't want to ask them, but and sometimes I think, especially as a junior, you may be a little bit intimidated and think, well, if they think, like, why is Lee asking this really basic question? It's obvious, isn't it? To them it is, to you it's not. That's a really powerful way of kind of getting up to speed without feeling like you're kind of intimidated by asking someone for help. And we've all been there. We all, and it's not necessarily the person's intimidating, it's just you feel intimidated to ask, well, surely I should know this. Why am I here if I'm asking a real basic question? And that's something like that, I think, is very, very useful. Sometimes you don't want to waste someone's time either. You'd be like, yeah, I could ask them, but I could also figure it out for myself. And again, that's where Copilot can come in and kind of fill in the blanks for you.
Yeah, is this, in the past, we would have this inner voice, and it would be a thought, and it would stop exactly there, as you said, because like you don't want to sound too stupid, you're embarrassed, you don't want to bother people, whatever, right? And now we have the ability like to channel that, and it still stays with us, but now we have this assistant, and you can ask them anything, and it doesn't go out there. So you can ask anything that comes up in your head, whether that's a good question, bad question, whether you miss something. You can ask it and you will get an answer, and you learn from that, right? So that is really, really great in terms of like even learning and evolving, right? Because you have this almost unlimited data source to which you can just tap and you can just ask away. And when you ask something that is, I don't know, maybe there's a huge caveat about doing something in a way, you will learn it, and then you can even come up with a better, more accurate, more specific question to those around you, right?
Exactly right.
Talk to them about,
it was, if the first approach to that person would be like, I've had a look at the code, I don't understand it, can you help me? Whereas you might be able to say, look, I've gone and had a look, I've done a bit of research, and this is what I found. Could we improve it this way or that way? Or you kind of, like I say, it's not necessarily going to answer all the questions that you might have for that person, but at least, like I say, kind of helps you along that way. You don't necessarily need to get someone involved to get you moving.
Very good, very good. Well, Lee, thank you very much for coming to join us today, to come in to chat about the way Copilots are helping you be more productive, both writing code and not writing code as well. So just helping you write code more, and sounds like stay out of meetings as well, or the meetings that you are in, you're coding in anyway now. So that's always a good thing. So thank you very much. And with that, we'll say bye-bye.
See ya, folks. Thank you, Lee.
Cheers. Thanks. Bye-bye.